Okay, so this lecture is on the social and cultural changes in China between 1949 and 1976. It's going to give you an overview of the changes for women, the changes made by collectivization, changes in education, healthcare, culture, and religion. So the first one we're going to start with is the changes for women. Now, arguably, when Mao came in and the communists took over, the biggest amount of change was created for women. Part of that is due to the abolishment of Confucian values. Mao wanted to completely abolish the traditional patriarchy. He wanted to remove this idea of women having to obey men and basically turn that system around, which is where you see we've got the sign for smash the patriarchy. The idea of communism was that women were to be treated equal to men in both a political, economic, cultural, educational, and social sphere. So that equality should expand through all of society. The first way he tried to create that change is through the creation of the marriage laws in 1950. Now, traditionally, in Confucian China, under the Confucian values, women were often put through arranged marriages. They were forced to marry through contractual family obligations, and they didn't really have a say in the matter. Mao himself wanted to abolish this, and he did that through the marriage laws of 1950. What that did is it stated that they should be able to marry whoever they wanted and completely remove this feudal system. It changed the basis of marriage. It moved from this contract between two families into this willing, freely engaged obligation by two individuals. Okay, and one of the reasons he introduced this is because he himself opposed arranged marriages through to his prior experiences, but also he felt that without the support of women, who made up approximately 50% of the population, revolution could not be achieved. So the marriage laws completely outlawed arranged marriages and dowries. It allowed people in forced marriages to get divorces. Marriages and divorces both now had to be registered with the local governments of the areas. Concubinage and polygamy were completely outlawed, and women could retain their pre-marriage properties in the case of a divorce, which was previously not the case. If they did get divorced, they'd have to give that land or that property over to their divorced husband. Now, another thing that was eradicated in the time of Mao was this idea of foot binding. Now, foot binding was an old Confucian tradition, and it was actually outlawed in 1911. But that process of outlawing it, the eradication of this practice, was sped up by communist rule. Another positive which came out of communism for women is the fact that their presence in the workforce quadrupled between 1949 and 1976. They went from making up 8% of the population to 32% of the population. Now, whilst this is a significant increase, actually 32% of the workforce is only under a third. So whilst there is an increase, that increase isn't a significant proportion of the workforce. In addition to that, the marriage laws also faced some backlash. There was a huge amount of resistance to the marriage laws in the west of China, which is where you found predominantly the Muslim regions. There were also some women who actually opposed the marriage laws because they opposed this shift of their traditional roles. They wanted to maintain those roles, which the communists were coming and overturning. Now, another impact on women is this idea of the Land Redistribution Act of 1950. Now, when this was put in place, the communists redistributed the land and peasants were able to get pieces of land. Now, for the first time, women could own land in their own name, and it kind of belonged to them. But this was obviously short-lived, as when collectivization was introduced, private land no longer existed. A pitfall for women is this introduction of communes. Now, theoretically, communes should have transformed lives for women and provided them with canteens, laundries, kindergartens, removing the domestic chores from them so that they could support agriculture. The reality was that actually working conditions were really, really poor. Few of these communes could actually provide these facilities, so women still had to do the domestic chores as well as supporting agriculture. But what it did do is actually it promoted this idea of sexual equality, but that wasn't always supported by the cadres. There were a number of cadres who usually actually held traditional attitudes towards sexual equality, so they didn't believe that women should have that equality. On top of that, in communes, people worked for work points. These work points came as a result of the physical labour that you did. Now, men traditionally got higher work points as they were able to do more physical work. Women could do less due to physical strength, etc., and this wasn't accounted for. This was also seen in pregnant women and women on their menses who could do less work, but this wasn't accounted for in their work points. Now, during the Great Famine, women's vulnerability increased as food became more scarce. Men could claim more rations because they were seen to do more work, and women often fed their children before they fed themselves. On top of that, in order to remove themselves from obligation, men often divorced their wives during the Great Famine, which meant the number of divorcees increased, so the rate of divorce increased, and it also meant that women were now left to fend for themselves. In addition, the family unit was also under attack during the Cultural Revolution, with the removal of the 4 olds, and children were encouraged to turn against their parents, so that meant women and mothers too. Now, moving on to education. Now, education in China showed a substantial increase. Between 1949 and 1964, the literacy rate went from 20% up to 64%. Now, it is argued that in those early years when the communists took over in 1950 to 1953, this rate could have increased even more substantially, but a lot of the funds were put into the Korean War instead of being used for primary education, therefore slowing that progress. In addition, later on in 1966, with the start of the Cultural Revolution, the rate of progress for education also declined. And that is because, as part of the 4 olds, education was attacked, universities destroyed, books destroyed, etc. So education increase slowed down. However, one pitfall is that the elitist system still remained in schools. Key schools were established, which attracted the best teachers, and these had entrance exams, and often those places, those quite rare places, were reserved for the kids of high-ranking individuals and officials. So this elitist system remained and actually meant that the schooling system did not completely adhere to communist values. However, the communists also introduced this language called pinyin. It was a modernized version of Mandarin, and it was officially adopted by the country in 1956 to assist the spread of literacy. What that meant is there was now a standardized language across the country instead of Mandarin, traditional Mandarin, which varied from region to region. The dialect, the way it was spoken, that varied, which meant that communication became quite difficult. The introduction of pinyin facilitated communication both across the country but also with other countries, because now there was a standard language which could be used to communicate with other countries. Overall, education did progress, but it was slowed by the Cultural Revolution and could have arguably been faster had the funds have been put in place. Now, moving on to healthcare. The biggest change for healthcare was the introduction of barefoot doctors. These were 1 million medical trainees. They were called barefoot doctors, and they were sent to provide medical help to rural peasants. So they were sent to the countryside alongside the disbanded Red Guards. They were given 6 months' worth of intensive study, and then they were dispatched to provide basic free healthcare. They promoted simple hygiene, preventative healthcare, family planning, and treated common disease. They were basically instilled to treat endemic diseases such as cholera, typhoid, scarlet fever. They were quite prevalent in the Chinese countryside, and so they were sent there to try and decrease that high mortality rate. They were also used on an ideological level, in that this education that they were being provided was very vocational. It was a practical and served a purpose. They gained their education and they went off to help support the people. In addition, sending them to the countryside meant that agriculture would also be supported and people would start to see the importance of agricultural development. In addition, it also served economic purposes. This training was very short, very sharp, very intense, and that meant it was relatively cheap to do. Also, the doctors' wages were being paid by the local governments, therefore making it cheaper to sustain. In addition, it was seen as such a success that some of these policies were taken inspiration from by the World Health Organization. So therefore, it acted as propaganda not only within China to show the growth of the Communist Party and reasons why people should support them, but also on an international level. Then we move on to culture. So Mao wanted to impose a proletarian culture on China to preserve gains made by the revolution. He wanted to use writers, artists, and musicians to shape culture. Traditional culture was attacked in the countryside, during the Cultural Revolution, and this became more intense. Now, to ensure the new proletarian culture took its place, Mao put in place Jiang Qing, his wife, in charge of cultural policy. She imposed revolutionary art and culture. She carried out policy ruthlessly. Her career as a previous actress helped her to give special insight into culture. She established a rigid form of censorship. All work had to satisfy her criteria of cultural purity before it could be published. But what this meant is that there was discrepancy amongst what was published. There were certain things that she agreed with and certain things that she didn't agree with. So people weren't really sure what their likelihood of being published was. Any artists who refused to comply were at best unemployed or sent to Laogai to be re-educated. She also used this as an opportunity to pursue vendettas against her enemies. So people she didn't like often couldn't get published. Old stories were reworked to support the new pro-communist narrative. So this was traditional story tales read to children, traditional books, etc. were all republished to support the pro-communist narrative. She was essentially able to completely stifle creativity and instill strict censorship. This supported the idea of continuous revolution, allowed this new proletarian culture to be established, and essentially increased her power within society too. Now, it's often argued that she didn't play a huge role. She was actually working on behalf of Mao and followed his instructions. But on the flip side, it could be argued that she was in charge of this specific sector, which meant that she could make those decisions. Finally, religion. Now, Article 5 of the Common Programme had stated that religious freedom would be allowed. The truth, however, was far from this. It became clear that there would be no long-term future for organised religions inside China. There was this view that there was no need for religions to exist. Authorities instead set up national religious associations for the main religions, whereby they were allowed to continue in existence but give up their independence. Mao felt that this didn't completely reduce the threat posed by religious groups on the revolution, and used the PLA to attack the establishments of the different groups. This was particularly significant in Tibet. Now, as we know, Tibet came under the influence of Mao and the People's Republic of China during the reunification campaigns. He wanted to keep it this way, so he instilled brutal policies to destroy outward signs of Buddhism, destroyed their temples, etc. In addition, Christianity, Islam, and Confucianism all also came under attack, as they were seen as incompatible with Marxism. And this became even more significant during the Cultural Revolution, when the Red Guards were ordered to remove the four alts. What this allowed him to do was to create the cult of Mao. He was becoming the cult of personality. It was communism that was becoming essentially the religion of the country. So those are all the ways in which social and cultural changes were made in China under the communists.